Okay, I think we're going to get started this evening. So welcome to those who have just logged on. I am excited for us to be launching the edited volume, edited by Dr. David Mark Macauley and Dr. Laura Pustarfi, whose title is The Wisdom of Trees, Thinking Through Arboreality. And we are very blessed to have some of our additional contributors here with us this evening. Dr. John Johnson is joining us this evening and will be reading from his chapter. And we'll see how many folks are going to be joining us online. And if we have time for questions at the end, we will sort of begin by engaging our two editors in a conversation about how this work emerged and their relationship to this topic. And then I'll be asking them to read small pieces from the book. And if we have time, we can then take some questions from the audience. So my name is Dr. Chantal Noa Forbes, and I'm currently serving as the interim chair for the Ecology, Spirituality and Religion program, who is hosting this evening's event. And our program is situated in the university building of the California Institute of Integral Studies, that's based on Mission Street in San Francisco, and occupies traditional unceded Ramaytush Ohlone lands. I myself am joining you this evening from Wilgurukaba country in northern Queensland, and I will introduce our editors and participants shortly. So Dr. David Macauley is Academy Professor and Professor Emeritus of Philosophy and Environment Studies at Penn State University, Brandywine. He's taught at Oberlin College, Emerson College, and New York University, and was a Mellon Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. Macaulay's the author of Elemental Philosophy, Earth, Air, Fire, and Water as Environmental Ideas, and editor of Minding Nature, The Philosophers of Ecology, co-editor of The Seasons, Philosophical, Literary, and Environmental Perspectives, and co-editor of the book that we are presenting this evening. He's published articles on ethics, aesthetics, politics, Greek philosophy, and continental thought. Macaulay is completing a book entitled Walking the Earth, Philosophical and Environmental Footnotes. He's also putting together a collection of philosophical parables and myths called Restoring Wisdom, and working on a book project titled Discovering Beauty in Dark Times. I believe that Dr. Macaulay recently relocated to Eureka, California, and he enjoys running beneath trees and forests, parks and cemeteries. Welcome, David. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Then our next guest this evening is Dr. Laura Pustarfi. Dr. Pustarfi is adjunct faculty at the California Institute of Integral Studies, both in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program, as well as in the Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion program. Dr. Pustarfi's work examines trees and plants in Western thought, with a particular focus on philosophical literature in order to explore an arboreal and vegetal ontology and ethics that respects plants themselves. Dr. Pustarfi has presented at several academic conferences, including those of the International Association for Environmental Philosophy, Torch Oxford, the Pacific Association for the Continental Tradition, and the International Society for Environmental Ethics. Dr. Pustarfi is director of the Psychedelic Assisted Therapies and Research Certificate Program at the California Institute of Integral Studies. And Dr. Pustarfi lives in the San Francisco Bay Area on occupied indigenous territory of the Coast Miwok and Southern Pomo, represented by the Federated Indians of Greater Rancheria. Thank you so much, Laura, for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, and thank you for putting this all together, Chantal, for us.
It's a pleasure. And since I did not prepare Dr. Johnson's bio ahead of time, I'd like to ask if you can perhaps just introduce Dr. Johnson as one of the book's contributors this evening.
Of course. So we have with us Dr. Dawn Hanlon Johnson, who is one of the leading thinkers in somatic studies and was a founder of the somatics program at CIIS and is now emeritus, as I understand, and has several books in I know one is called Diverse Bodies, Diverse Voices, several books on philosophy, somatics, various ways of thinking, and then has contributed the afterword to the book, which we're excited that he can read a bit from today.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you so much, Laura. And thank you, Dr. Johnson, for joining us this evening. So I'd like to begin this evening on a personal note. And I want to begin by asking each of you to perhaps share a story about your personal connection to trees. So how and when did you first become conscious of coming into relationship with the plant world? And perhaps, Laura, I'll ask you to begin.
Sure, and I appreciate this question, especially with the way that you phrased it around coming into relationship with the plant world. I certainly wouldn't have used those terms when I was younger or when I was growing up, but that connection started at that time. I remember often being outdoors as a child, playing in the yard and noticing the plants and noticing the trees. And I also had other experiences as I was growing up, and especially one that I wanted to note that's relevant to the volume is that when I was at the College of Charleston in South Carolina, there was a large push to save not just the one tree called the angel oak, which is about a 400 or 500 year old live oak in South Carolina on Johns Island, but to preserve several yards around it, quite a long way around it, to preserve those other trees as a way of preserving the relationships between the trees and to stop development for quite a ways around the tree and to preserve that entire area as a park, not just the tree itself. And that, well, I wasn't involved with that movement at the time. It made an impression on me. There was quite a lot of news about it while I was living there, and it made an impression on me that there was more happening with trees and the connections between different trees in the forest than I had previously thought. And I was fairly young at the time. And then I was happy when the publishers chose to use an image of that particular tree, of the angel oak tree, on the cover of the volume. That one was one that was particularly special to me.
Yeah, thank you for that, Laura. And that's a really special, phenomenal being, that tree. And I have to say, it's definitely touched me as well. David.
Yeah, thanks for the question and welcome everyone. Thank you for coming out or showing up this afternoon, or maybe it's a different time zone for you. Here it's, I don't know, 5:40 something. So I don't know, I guess there's probably not like a real single story, a kind of smoking gun or burning tree or something um, that did it for me. I do remember, though, in that regard, that when my neighbors growing up in this little town called Bloomsburg in Pennsylvania cut down a really healthy tree, or what I took to be at the time when I was a kid, I was kind of confused and probably even a little bit angry about this. Just kind of, why are they killing and cutting down the tree? I couldn't see a reason. But kind of maybe wanted to point to something that's a little bit different than many experiences, which are, in the woods or connecting with an individual tree is that for me, at least, it was working and interacting with the wood from the trees. We had to do a lot of things like gardening, but my father and my brother and I built a tree house in the apple tree, a two-story tree with a tent over top of it. And so we spent, evenings sleeping in it. We were sort of required to do a lot of woodwork and carpentry around the house. We put in a wood burning stove. It had a fireplace. And then I lived in West Virginia on a farm, where you kind of had, there was a use of the trees, the forest relocated, in a sense. The yard that I grew up in had fruit trees, so we had to pick the apples or the cherries or the pears. Later in New York, so it's a series of kind of building, a series of events that kind of build up over time. In New York, my roommate and I tore up the carpet and the tile to get down to the hardwood floors, which we valued more than the carpeting. And then in Philadelphia, I was just struck by the neighborhood that I more recently lived in, that all the streets had tree names: larchwood, hazel, pine, chestnut. So the point was that maybe more indirectly, the trees kind of entered into my thinking, my worldview, as well as, just growing up doing scouting and hiking and running in the woods. That was maybe the more direct route. And now I live in Humboldt County, which has all the tall redwood trees and the sequoias, which are amazing. If you haven't seen them or visited them, or put them on your bucket list, because they're just quite amazing.
Thank you, David. Don, do you have a story to add?
Yes. I'm sitting here looking out my window at a small grove that's protected of old growth redwood. And in preparing for this event, I was thinking about it all. And I counted the years I've lived among the redwoods. And so I'm 91, and I've lived for 45 years in the redwoods. So they become very close to me and had a huge impact on me. And I thought, well, what is it? What is that impact? And I'm too speedy. I talk too much. I think too fast. And the redwoods calm me down. So I walk out of my house. There are trails back here. They're so quiet. And I'm just over the ridge from Muir Woods, which is a very large. And as David said, these coastal mountains are just filled with these little preserves everywhere of the old growth redwoods. And I've found them such a calming and easing force in my life. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. That segues actually really nicely into my next question, which is to ask if each of you can talk about how your personal relationship to trees morphed into a scholarly interest or even a scholarly practice. And I think maybe, Don, when you share, I'd like you to maybe share how this somatically expresses itself in scholarly practice. But Laura, let's start with yourself again. What was that journey like, and what were some of the significant influences that you came across on that journey?
Yes. So as I was looking into my own course of study and looking at a scholarly career, I was wanting to focus on environmental issues and social issues, and then also religious, spiritual issues, mythological issues. And I will admit that kind of as I was thinking about this and considering doctoral work and wanting to find a direction with this, I was in a liminal space one morning and kind of had the spark, the inspiration of, oh, what if I studied trees? Then I can look at trees from an environmental and ecological perspective. I can look at issues like who has access to forests. I can look at religious issues around trees, how trees have been seen in religions around the world and appear in mythology and literature and art. And they kind of took over from there in a lot of ways. And as I continue to write, I try to do that when I can outdoors. I have a very regular practice of walking and running and hiking, and spend as much time when I can with the trees themselves. So I would say that the trees are some of the biggest inspirations and influences in the journey themselves, especially as I um, spent more time with the phenomenological method and perspective, and spent more time with the trees themselves, thinking phenomenologically with thinkers like Merleau-Ponty and others. I will say that some of the thinkers who have influenced me, the Buddhist scholar Stephanie Kazaa has this wonderful work on called Conversations with Trees. And then others who have been in the plant studies world, like Michael Marder and Matthew Hall, have been big influences, as well as people like Suzanne Simard, the forest ecologist, who is the one who's been describing the mycorrhizal networks between trees and fungi, and Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's a biologist and member of the Potawatomi Nation, who's I'm sure many people have heard of her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. That was a huge influence on me as well. But I think the trees themselves have been the biggest influence, and I think I've been a little surprised that I have continued to follow this path with the trees, and continue. Got other projects with trees as well that continue to be of interest and exciting.
Thank you, Laura. David.
Yeah, thanks for that, Laura. I would say in general, I have an interest in sort of the everyday world. In other words, something that pushes back a little bit against the traditional focus within philosophy on the abstract, the transcendental, the otherworldly. And so, whether it's the seasons or walking or the elements, my initial entry point into environmental thought was through animals, focusing on animals. And there's been a lot of work that's come out since that time as my undergraduate days. And then that kind of morphed into an interest in the elemental, the earth, air, fire, water, and other forms of the elemental. And then there's been the more recent interest in plants. I actually foresee myself, I have this emerging interest in insects, simply because they're just amazing to look at and explore. And there's not been so much within philosophy on insects. And I feel like maybe I'm drawn to some things that are overlooked or marginalized, kind of like plant blindness, fronting what is backgrounded. I'd say maybe in terms of the scholarly interest or the academic, probably more initial drawn in through the writing on forests than, say, individual trees. And I would say works like Robert Pogue Harrison's Forests. I believe the subtitle is something like The Shadow of Civilization. Christopher Stone's legal work on the status of trees. And then more recently, Richard Powers, I think it's quite amazing book called The Overstory, some of you may know. And probably it's even fair to say that more than philosophy, I've been inspired by the poetry about trees. And, Seamus Heaney, Robert Frost has some amazing tree poems, W.S. Merwin, the lyrical aspects of celebrating trees. Maybe one final note is during the pandemic, we're all locked in and couldn't get out so much into the woods, although that was an option. I think a lot of people took up walking then. I wrote a sort of forest fairy tale where the trees actually are addressing, as personified beings, the climate problem. So those kind of literary and where literature meets philosophy in other areas is maybe a sort of interest or inspiration.
Thank you for that, David. Yeah, but did you publish that fairy tale?
It's part of a trilogy narrated by a donkey that metamorphoses into a horse and a zebra. So it's three, and then I'm having an artist friend's going to illustrate them. So they're hopefully going to be published. Its working title is The Second Story World: Fairy Tales for Adults and Curious Children. But if anyone wants to read a fairy tale with some illustrations in it, I will put a link in the chat if you looking for something to read at night.
We appreciate that. Don, what can you share on this topic?
Well, first, I just want to thank David and Laura for doing this. I feel it's such a dangerous time, and I think it takes a lot of angles to face the danger. So I've been very involved for many, many years in all kinds of Earth things, but not thinking through the objective Earth, all of the intricacies that are revealed by all these people in the collection you've made, ranging from the science of roots and interconnection of living things and all of the things that go with them, the birds and the insects and the tree and the waters. So I'm very grateful for your doing this. And so I just was raised in the Sacramento Valley, going out hunting, fishing, and then gradually getting into wilderness trekking and river running and all kinds of things like that by my loved ones who helped me find that. And so it's been very much a part of me that the importance right now of the science of it all is so great that you're bringing that to the fore. So I have a lot of hope for little things like this that need to be explored.
So once again, leading on from what Don just shared, I want to ask if you can talk a little bit, David and Laura, about the genesis of this edited volume. So how did the conversation of this project begin between you? And why do you think it's important, or why did you think it was important to birth this edited volume?
Sure. I'm happy to jump in first, if that's all right with you, David. And I think this project started maybe sometime in 2018 or early 2019 when David suggested this volume and this idea. And it did take several years before we really got started working on it. And I know we had started with a panel and then kind of continued to think about it. And we set out a call for papers to several scholars who we thought might have interest in this topic, and we're able to find SUNY that was interested in publishing it fairly quickly. But we had noticed that there was not very much philosophical thinking within the Western tradition towards trees. More thinking has been happening around plants, in particular since the last maybe 15 years. The field of plant studies has really flourished, but very little on trees, especially from within the continental tradition. So we felt like this volume could offer that, and specifically on arboreality as a starting place for a conversation as well.
Yeah, I think you covered it. I would just add, so Laura was the one who, on her dissertation, that was rethinking trees in the Western paradigm and reached out to me to be part of the committee. And then that led to, as she said, to a panel at a conference. And then we got the book contract fairly quickly, because I think there's just a general interest emerging around it, the topic and the importance of it. In terms of why it's important to me, apart from the effects in the world, it was an interesting opportunity to collaborate with another scholar, writer, and somebody who loved the outdoors and the trees. And the collaboration, when I think about it, was interesting because it's across, let's just say, genders, generational differences, time zones, and to maybe a lesser extent, disciplines and also institutions. we're coming from different places, but found a node in a meeting point with the tree or the forest. And that piqued my interest as both a challenge collaborating and an opportunity to learn. And I did learn a lot from Laura and through Laura, and certainly through roughly 15, 16 contributors. So I don't claim to be a botanist or an expert on trees, but sometimes you take these on and you learn in, and that's, to me, a great opportunity.
Well, thank you, David. And I just want to also add that going back to kind of what Don, you were saying about the kind of perilous nature of this time too, I think that it's also just an important book and a time to think about trees and forests with deforestation happening and the environmental concerns that are ongoing, and spending time with the trees has been very kind of activating for me, and hoping that the book will do something similar for others as well, in terms of thinking more deeply about the arboreal neighbors that we share the earth with.
So each of you have highlighted, in a sense, a kind of urgency around this conversation and deep relevance in this conversation. And so I want to push you a little further, and anyone can respond here on why philosophy and arboreality. So what is significant about the history of different schools of philosophical thought and the agency of trees in the development of this thought?
Yeah. I can briefly say something maybe about the philosophy. I think Laura's focused more on sort of agency of trees, which is important too. I think the way we might have put it in the introduction, correct me if I'm wrong, Laura, 'cause I haven't reread it in a while, but that there's almost something like a philosophical fork in the woods, maybe was sort of within philosophy, whereby one road, to use the Robert Frost kind of image, treats trees as very low in status and on the chain of being and ontology. They're sort of down at the bottom of the hierarchy as mere matter, just above sort of rocks. And so that trees weren't really and aren't given their due, that they're seen as passive, inert, sometimes not even, fully alive, or certainly not having a kind of agency. But then there's another one that starts to emerge. We could discuss when that happens, but or where it happens, but it certainly starts to happen with some of the phenomenologists, to a certain extent, Heidegger or Merleau-Ponty. It happens in different ways in the East, in Taoism and Buddhism, certainly, where there's enlightenment under the tree, the Bodhi tree. And then more recently with figures like Michael Martyr and Matthew Hall and Monica Gagliano and so forth. So that there's this kind of, if not ambivalence, certainly a bifurcated, complex relationship that philosophy has had with forests and trees. It's in Taoism, there are, sites of mystery and where the rebels would go in southern China, that they had more than mere use value. In fact, Chuangzi talks about the useless tree. And so it's that tension that is interesting. And I think, and again, Laura can speak to this, maybe how more recently with the science, there's a discovery of the agency, the power, the importance of trees to healthy ecosystems emerging that start to back up some of the speculation or intuition that others that were part of this minoritarian tradition sensed. So, and then of course the emergence of sort of critical plant studies that I suspect many of the people that are in the audience today have some familiarity with.
I would add to that too, and I might also just say that I think that if you asked all of the contributors to the book this question, they may have different answers. So, Ton, I'm also curious what you have to say as well. But in terms of the philosophical aspect of looking at trees and thinking deeply about the trees themselves and the human relationship to the trees. In some ways, that tradition started back with, in the Western philosophical tradition, back with the ancient Greek thinkers and thinking of trees as lower in a hierarchy than animals and then lower than humans. And part of the reclaiming or reconsidering this word arboreality, it's a common term in the sciences and speaks to animals that live in trees, but it hasn't been commonly used in the humanities. And the point of using this term is to think about trees, the play on the Latin word arbor for tree, and the concept of reality. So thinking somewhat metaphysically about trees in a different way. The philosopher who we've brought up a few times, Michael Marder, talks about plants as a living reversal of metaphysics. And part of this term is thinking there about perhaps that proliferation and profusion there of the trees within the mind, the human mind. And as David was mentioning, there's quite a bit on agency with trees and with plants coming out in terms of the more recent science. The field of science is often called plant signaling and behavior. It's very contested about what capacities trees and plants have. But oftentimes trees are not seen as agential at all, and that they are just reacting to the environment, reacting to the wind or to the animals or to soil conditions, those kinds of things, and not acting decisively. However, some people, and myself included, are thinking that trees can act decisively. There's many capacities that trees have been shown to have: memory and learning, and the relational networks with fungi that were mentioned a little bit earlier, that do point towards trees making potentially making decisions. For example, to have greater connection with what's actually called their kin trees, and where they can actually, what's called self non-self recognition. So that those terms are being used in some of the scientific literature as well, pointing towards that sense of agency. So it seems like there's a place for a philosopher in that conversation as well.
I see the conversation as part of a much more basic need right now, which is how are we going to get some force behind saving the planet if we don't know what it is? So there are, yeah, I'd say most people grow up with kind of a vague sense of the earth. They've not dealt with storms, fires, floods, earthquakes, all of that. And so there's a distance there based on a lack of familiarity. So I think that this is one very important piece to say, what is this thing that we're supposed to be saving? Why should we bother? Why should we give up something to save something we don't know really? So I think there's a huge ignorance of the actual earth, what it really is, of which trees are a huge part and which are being, stripped away to protect us from fire. So it's like, I think this learning what our home is here in detail, not just abstractly about love of earth, is really crucial right now.
Thank you for that, Don, and for drawing our attention to the role of familiarity, right? And the role of relationality in taking action. Before we go into talking a little bit about the contributors and the structure of the book, I wanted to ask, and I'm not sure if David or Laura, who is going to be doing this, but if one of you could read a little bit from either the introduction or the introductory chapters to the book, just to give a sense, give the audience a sense of what this sounds like. This conversation that we're having, in some sense, can also sound a little abstract, maybe to those sitting in the audience, but what is it that we're talking about here? What is the conversation that's taking place in the book?
Go ahead, Laura. I don't know what do you
Sure.
have something that would fit there?
I'm happy to. I will admit that I had prepared a brief passage from my chapter, but I can find one from the introduction as well. Just to give a sense. Let's see. We'll just find a couple of chapters here. A couple of, excuse me, paragraphs here. All right, I'm happy to read. So this is from the introduction, and it's a section called The Arboreal World. And I'll just read a couple of paragraphs for us here. Trees are not just generally older than humans, they are also very different from us in their existence as sessile modular beings. These woody perennial plants form the backbone of forest ecology, providing habitats for mammalian, avian, amphibian, and insect species. Their roots connect soil systems, their trunks verticalize water, and their canopies create hidden worlds in the sky. We know them as photosynthesizers, tasked with transforming sunlight into sugars and sustenance for themselves and other forest occupants. They offer in exchange for the air we breathe as one of their many contributions to planetary cycles. We evolved as a species in the shade of trees, built societies in the openings of forests, and created economies, art, and stories with and within arboreal boughs. Forests are fundamental to human cultures. Vast stands of trees and their clearing helped to establish the ground of most civilizations. Trees form our homes and the pages of our books, and they are incorporated widely into our consumer products, including even toothpaste. They provide us with innumerable edibles, including fruits and nuts, as well as a source of medicinal knowledge. Trees have been locations for civic assemblies, shelters for weddings, and markers for both birth and death. Beyond the woods, affluent neighborhoods congregate trees in parks and gardens, along streets and in yards to heighten property appeal. These trees afford habitats, beautify communities, impacting positively our health and psychology. Notably, less affluent urban regions are often relatively devoid of trees and green space, a sad social commentary on the landscape. Maybe I'll just read one more paragraph here. Trees inspire creativity and excite fears. They appear in myth, story, poem, and song in guises from primordial characters to archetypal divinities. Religious iconography and lore makes use of trees and the woods in origin stories and throughout religious practice. Trees appear as vessels for spiritual wisdom, subjects of praise, and loci of mystical experience. Far beyond the mundane, the forest can be a place of heightened beauty or deep chthonic terror. It can issue into a sublime experience for the romantically inclined, leading to poetic insights. Trees appear as figures in fairy tales and folklore, or primary metaphor in world literature. The visible structure of a tree lends itself to hierarchy and helps to form symbolic configuration for a philosophical, cultural, and scientific thought.
Thank you, Laura, for sharing that with us. First, I just want to ask before I continue if John or David have any comments to respond to what Laura wrote.
It's a great summary.
Yes.
Just that once you start thinking about trees, I think, and maybe certain other things it holds true for as well, you find the connections everywhere. These branches, there's roots reach into, all sorts of fields. It's almost how to delimit it. Um, one of the things I remember sort of just hitting upon was tree marriage, that in certain countries, India and Mexico, some people are actually marrying trees as a way to sort of either protect them or for more personal reasons and beliefs about, reproduction and things. I was like, wow, it's just their arborescence is kind of proliferating into so many different things. Some of which came up, I think, in that passage, how we use trees and rely on them and their significance.
And so this introduction or portion of the introduction that you read, Laura, really talks to a lot of different themes. It talks to a lot of different philosophical schools of thought, a lot of different cultural traditions, and even a variety of academic disciplines. And so I'd like to ask either yourself or David to share a little bit about the nature of some of the chapters that are included in this volume and who the contributors are that sort of gifted these chapters to the volume.
Sure. David, did you want to start us off? Should I?
Ken, so one thing, of course, is it's a CIIS event, and there's maybe now with Don 5 contributors, right? So there's a core. The mother tree is, so to speak, is CIIS. But let me think. I'll identify a few, and you can. So Eric Orts, who teaches at Wharton Business School and has a background in environmental law, contributed a chapter on the legal status of trees, relying and building upon Christopher Stone's famous legal article on, I think it's called "Do Trees Have Standing?" Meaning legal standing, by, I said, Christopher Stone. And it talks about the flexibility of this category of personhood, and makes a case for at least the inclusion of some trees as having rights or a legal status. Luke Fisher did a wonderful piece on language of trees and the communication and how to think of language as having like a gestural genesis. He relies on Merleau-Ponty and Goethe and phenomenology to develop this language of arboreality. Ed Casey, who was my dissertation director at Stony Brook, collaborated with Michael Marder on to sort of develop a view of the place and places of trees, where trees actually can be a place, not just kind of create place, and a sort of a rich phenomenological description of their arborescence. Let's see, a couple others. On a different note, Mara Miller has a chapter on the appearance, the representation, and significance of trees in Eastern art, focusing on Japan and China in particular, but looking at Buddhism and to a lesser extent some other Eastern traditions. And it's richly illustrated with old images. Maybe one or two more. Recently, he passed away in the fall, I want to say. Alfonso Lingus, who has done a lot of wonderful work in philosophy and related areas, has a chapter on the birth and death of trees, just their sort of biological significance and cultural significance. He even speaks about some trees, and I believe it's in Indonesia, if I'm recalling correctly, where babies, children that had died are planted inside the trunk of the tree. And another one, David Rothenberg, who's a musician and philosopher. He does a lot of work with and actually plays music with birds and insects and whales and other organisms. Has a piece in the aesthetics section called Do Trees Sing? In other words, thinking about the aesthetics of trees and whether they communicate are capable of communication in different sorts of ways. And he brings his rich musical background to reflect on this vis-a-vis some other writers on trees like David Haskell. So those are a few. I don't know if you want to add to that, Laura.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, David. And I can mention a few of the contributors, as you noted, who are from CIIS, in addition to myself and Dawn. So one is Kimberly Carfore, who's an alumna of the ESR, of Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion, as well. And she contributed a chapter primarily on ecofeminist materialism, looking at the work of Luce Irigaray, as well as Val Plumwood, and really putting those thinkers in conversation with a redwood tree that she calls grandmother redwood, and speaks about her own experiences with the redwood in looking at an ecofeminist perspective as well, and also kind of an ontological perspective in her chapter. So that's under the section Trees as Beings. And then we also have Matt Segall, who contributed a chapter on vegetal imagination, putting the philosopher Michael Marder, who we've talked about, and who contributed as well in conversation with Schelling and Whitehead, and thinking about Schelling and Whitehead's philosophy as an exemplary way of thinking about Michael Marder's what he calls plant thinking. And then we also have Sam Mickey, who has also taught here at CIIS and is a graduate, who talked about philosophers with an aversion to trees and the idea of the useless tree, and thinking through those philosophical perspectives in his chapter. And just to note also, you mentioned so many of the chapters, David, but also wanted to mention that John Charles Ryan, who's more of a literary scholar, has a chapter on Aboriginal Australian perspectives and memory, in particular, in relationship to trees as well. And then Daniel Bradley, who teaches philosophy at Gonzaga University, has written about the silence of the primeval forest as well, and thinking about silence and sound in the forest. Also talks a bit about Irigaray in his chapter. So, and one other to mention is the foreword by John Maloof, who is a professor emeritus and has more so been in the scientific realm, looking at trees, and is the founder of the Old Growth Forest Network. So she contributed a foreword to the volume. And then David and I, throughout the course of the volume, wrote very short interstices where we paired a photo with a bit more of a reflective piece to separate the various sections. One is on redwoods. I know, David, you contributed one on the apple tree you mentioned earlier, and various other ones, eucalyptus, that we looked at with a bit more of a reflective lens throughout the course of the book.
We got to include some photos too. They're in black and white.
Well, thank you both for sharing that. It really sounds like a rich collection of chapters. And I'd like to ask David if you would like to read either from one of those inserts or from your own chapter. Is there anything you'd like to share from what you wrote in the volume?
Sure. The chapter I contributed is called 13 Ways of Looking at a Tree. And it's basically a reflection on the aesthetics of trees and how we might appreciate them in terms of their beauty. And it was a challenge because, there's 80 to 100,000 different species of trees, and how can you capture this? But I tried to, it was a challenge to think through. I'm just giving a little bit of context. Some of the other of the 12 from which I won't be reading are like the function, the sensuous qualities of trees, the ambient dimensions, the holistic dimensions, what you could call suchness or thusness, butility, which is a sort of word that combines beauty and use. So what I thought I'd do is read from this section on stories. The idea that being that there's often a narrative connected with forests or trees that it often includes us as well as the forest or the arboreal realm. So I'll read an excerpt from that. Humans have long been fascinated by tales, both fictional and factional, involving trees and forest. Siddhartha Gautama sits under a Bodhi tree and achieves enlightenment. Newton is struck by a falling apple and discovers gravity. The sages of China find wisdom and beauty in trees, which also provides inspiration for Eastern poets and painters. Hansel and Gretel are abandoned in the woods. Nathaniel Hawthorne's young Goodman Brown sets off on an odd errand into the forest. The family patriarch in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude is tied to a chestnut tree after he goes mad, and a host of humans are transformed into trees in Ovid's Metamorphosis. Including Daphne, who is changed into a laurel to escape the lust of Apollo, Cyparissus, who is converted into a cypress so that he may grieve the death of his pet deer, and the couples Baucis and Philemon, who become entwined oak and linden trees for eternity as a reward for their hospitality to disguised gods. In Italo Calvino's novel, The Baron and the Trees, a 12-year-old boy refuses to eat a plateful of snails and in protest climbs up a knobby holm oak tree, never to descend again, spending his entire life in numerous treetops, where he hunts, fishes, marries, fights forest fires, and wins the respect of scientists and philosophers throughout Europe. Even upon the vast sea, the tall mast of the ship and Ahab's wooden leg take on arboreal significance in Melville's Moby Dick. Barefoot in pauper's clothes with a tin pot for a cap, John Chapman, more widely known as Johnny Appleseed, plants nurseries throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana. Because Chapman opposed grafting, the apples he grew were likely not intended for eating, but instead only used for making cider. As food writer Michael Pollan suggests, Johnny Appleseed was welcome in cabins throughout the Midwest because he was carrying the gift of alcohol to the frontier as, quote, America's Dionysus. So those are a few examples of that. Storytelling reveals meaning without committing the error of defining it, observes Hannah Arendt. We are invariably drawn to the power of stories and even continue to tell them ourselves as we sleep and dream. In Wired for Story, Lisa Cron points out that story, as it turns out, was crucial to our evolution, more so than opposable thumbs. Opposable thumbs let us hang on. Stories told us what to hang on to. And one thing, of course, we've clung to in our history as a species is trees. Stories provide us with a shared experience in a fragmented culture. They help bind us together, and they assist in seeing phenomena as parts of a greater, more integrated whole. As one of the oldest art forms that may have originated around a glowing campfire, but now extends to novels, myths, plays, and films, stories provide adaptive advantages that enable us to survive. They permit us to work out scenarios in life with little risk and low cost. They offer us a way to communicate practical and memorable information across cultures and generation, and they encourage us to explore and examine the beliefs, perspectives, and values of other people. In their own way, trees also tell us stories. They convey to us what has happened and what is presently unfolding in the land around them, including below the ground, in the canopy, and through the material flows in the soil. They, quote, speak to us, they speak to each other about insects, water, humidity, sunlight, and much else. They hold memory in their concentric rings and through their witnessing of events over long stretches of time. And in turn, they hold in their concentric rings and through their witnessing of events over time, stretches of time. And as if to further ballast this point, we speak curiously both of an overstory and an understory in the forest, unconsciously acknowledging in our language the role of arboreal time and narrative. The very word tree is related to truth through the Proto-Indo-European root deru, meaning to be firm, solid, or steadfast. And it suggests the aspirational sense of seeking light and enlightenment in the above. Indeed, every tree has a truth to share. Leaves are intricate and ordered maps that can be read and studied. Like animal hands or paws, their shapes, lines, and veins help to tell us who they are, how they've been, and where they might be going. In the process, these arboreal tales help to communicate storied residence in the land, a kinship and belonging to the larger biotic community, and one of the greatest stories ever told, namely the epic of evolution. This way of seeing and listening to trees also suggests the merits of a narrative view of environmental aesthetics, which relates events in time to place in a manner that can satisfactorily explain seasonal changes or the amazing vertical lifespan and horizontal afterlife of a branching woody organism. Here we can point as well to the close connection between the library, the place where stories are collected, organized, and stored, and the forest from which books historically originate and still depend. Library, in fact, is related to the Latin liber, which was originally the inner bark of trees and perhaps derives from the Proto-European root meaning leaf or rind. As Gary Snyder points out in a short essay called The Forest and the Library, both are highly developed, complex, and intelligent information sharing systems and site of concentrated consciousness. Astronomer Carl Sagan has noted too how books are composed from trees. A book is, quote, an assemblage of flat, flexible parts, still called leaves, imprinted with dark pigmented squiggles. One glance at it and you hear the voice of another person, perhaps someone dead for thousands of years. The last part of this section, which, maybe for the interest of time, I'm happy to read it, but is briefly a story from Richard Powers' Overstory, where they take, a character photographs a single chestnut tree across generations, and you learn about this deeper sense of time. And then the second story that I relate, it involves ginkgo trees of Hiroshima in Japan. Ginkgo is embraced by the Pure Land Buddhists, and it's about these kind of survivor trees, which connect the people to the place and in a sense tell stories of the survivors. So anyway, that's a brief excerpt of one of 13 possible ways of looking at a tree, and there are likely more.
Thank you, David, for that. And so many things popped to my mind as you were reading from that chapter, and I just want to ask Laura and Don actually what emerged for them while you were reading. Do you have any responses to this interrelationship between trees and story and trees as story?
Well, I noticed that one of the themes that's kind of emerged for me during this event is the need to take seriously trees, not as just instrumental, not just for our use, but as what they are in themselves. Because it's the devastation of trees, like other things that we have used just for our own needs, that is destroying them.
I completely agree with that statement. And And also just in terms of what you had said earlier, David, it appeared in what you read as well, just how often trees appear in story, how often trees appear in various ways of thinking that are maybe mm, uh, not as top of mind in certain ways, or that we don't necessarily consider as trees. You mentioned Moby Dick, the way that trees appear in Moby Dick, and other stories that we may not think about as arboreal stories, but they appear, and the urgency of protecting them comes to the forefront for me as well, often.
Yeah, as David was reading, I was thinking about the cedar tree in Lebanon, and I was thinking about the ways in which that tree, which is deeply threatened now and has been for some time, has also been woven into religious texts and histories and stories about conquest and power. And so the long history and stories of those trees are still with us now, which talks to your point, Laura, of us needing to take urgent action to support their ongoing continuation in their own right, and not only for our utilitarian use. And before I'm going to ask Don to also read from the afterword, but before I go there, you know, I'm very conscious that the idea behind this book is to start a conversation around trees and about trees, and the role of trees in our ecosystems and in our planetary community and in our lives. And so I'd like to actually take maybe 2 to 3 questions or comments from the audience at this point, and to see if anyone would like to ask a question of either of you, or if you'd like to share what this conversation has brought up for you as we've been dialoguing this evening. And so you can either put a question in the chat or raise your hand if you do have your camera on. And I know that there are several persons in the audience who are working on plants and studying trees here too. So I welcome your questions or comments.
It's a silent forest so far. I can hear some rustling in the leaves and the canopy and some thoughts going on out there.
Maybe I can ask a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Hi from Arizona. Thank you for this. I'm sitting here with the book, and it's been really nice to hear it come to life in these ways. I work on plants in German studies. I'm a literary scholar, and so I was curious. I heard a lot of literary allusions, but I know I think Joan Ryan is the only literary scholar in the mix, and I was curious sort of how that came to be, and in general sort of choices or how it came together in that way in the interdisciplinarity. When I look through the table of contents, there's a lot of variety, whether that was your goal. I'm also asking because there is, of course, a lot of work in literary studies on trees, and maybe I can put one reference in the chat if anyone is interested in that stuff in particular. And since there were so many resonances with stories, especially in what you read, David, I was sort of curious how you were negotiating that, and if I may ask a second, if you were considering not just cultures, like a variety of cultures, but maybe also languages beyond English, whether that was ever a consideration. I know that's, of course, always a practical issue, or it can be, but just curious sort of how how the connections came to be for you in the combinations that you have.
Yeah, if I understood the question correctly, how did it, I think one sort of answer was we reached out to our friends in continental philosophy and environmental philosophy and related areas, and pretty much it seems like everybody we inquired with said yes, because I think it just shows that there's a passion for talking about and thinking about and writing about trees, because it's something that's like particular. It's not really abstract. It resists us, but it invites us. It's, there's can be a poetic quality, but there can be just a sort of, yeah, how do we think about these things that populate our world, or, increasingly disappear from our world? And we sort of cobbled this together with I'm not going to speak for Laura, but I sensed it was a kind of pluralism, openness to a range of styles. We were looking for maybe a through line or a thread, of some degree of coherence, but we weren't looking for some ideology to impose on it, because while there have been pieces written in philosophy, as you, I think, rightfully pointed out, more so in other areas in literature, in eco-criticism and so forth. So we wanted to just open up that space, and see what emerged. And I think we were pretty happy that it drew a range. So we were trying to cover ontology, maybe a little bit of epistemology, some value questions, ethics, aesthetics, politics, etc. In terms of John Ryan, I had communicated with him with Luke Fisher and I had edited a collection on the seasons, and he contributed a piece. Laura may know him, and she can through the critical plant studies group. So there were also the core of the CIIS group that contributed. So that's one kind of answer. I think your second question had to do, could you clarify that about the language? I think meaning including like foreign,
Well, yeah, I
yeah.
mean it's fairly English centric from a first look, right? I mean, of course, they're the traditions that you draw on are from all over the world, the cultural traditions as well, and often this is a practical issue. But I think I understand more given your response with the focus on philosophy and different areas of that might have just been what necessitated that as well, aside from practical
I would say it's
considerations.
the continental tradition we were working in, because that's the SUNY Press. We thought we'd angle for them, and they do a lot of continental work. Yeah, we were aware that we wanted to, there the John Ryan's Australian Aboriginal connection there, and then there's a piece on China. Certainly, the book we would have kept going and expanded it more. I even think that there, a follow-up or another volume could be done on, say, forest focused, and include other voices as well. So it was a tricky task, editing, when you're trying to be as inclusive, but also, yeah, Laura, do you want to jump in on any of this?
Yes, and thank you for the question. Yes, so I agree with everything you said, David, and I think that this is a starting point. There could be certainly other volumes that focus otherwise on trees, and this project also we've been working on it, I want to say, for about 5 years, and so the landscape in the conversation has changed a lot as well. And I know that there's quite a lot published in German, which makes sense. Where forest management was developed as well. So there's the book is focused on the English language, but there could be lots of possibilities for other work, and hopefully this is a starting point to that conversation, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and within multiple languages. Yeah, thank you.
And Laura, and if you can just continue, I just want to answer Stephen White's question, and a continuation on what you're saying, where Stephen asks which contributors and chapters emphasize issues that most deeply affect Indigenous peoples. So maybe if you could just talk to that, and then I'll take a question from Barbara.
Sure. Yes. And I would say John Ryan's chapter speaks very directly in terms of the Aboriginal Australian perspective. And other chapters touch on it. I will say the book is grounded in the Western philosophical tradition, and so the chapters do focus on that intellectual tradition, with trying to be respectful of traditions across the world, and we acknowledge in the introduction that we weren't able to include every voice, and so that is something that there's certainly more room for more voices as well. And I'm curious, David, if you would add anything to that.
Not offhand. Sorry, I was reading some of the other questions, like asking us what about our favorite tree and things like that. So, but nothing more than that. Which
Yeah,
is always
thank
a
you, Deb.
fun topic, it's a fun. I kind of even want to hear, if I could throw that back to the audience, if anybody wants to put a few words in the chat, what your favorite tree is, maybe a few comments why. I would throw out the banyan tree, but that hijacks the question. So, sorry, go ahead, Chantal.
No, but I was actually going to just make the same recommendation. I've been spending a lot of time with banyan trees this week, so I resonate with that. But I was just going to say, people, please, if everyone can please put their favorite tree in the chat, and Laura, David, and Don, if you can also please share that in the chat. I'll take one more question, and then we'll sort of move towards our closing reading. Barbara.
Thank you. Yes, thank you all for writing such an incredibly rich book. And you've spoken a little bit about kind of the intelligence of trees. And I have been reading just a little bit about the kind of cutting some of the current thinking about plants in general. And I know from a neuroscientific perspective, often consciousness is considered to be present when there's a nervous system. But in relation to plants, they clearly act with consciousness, and trees in general, I'm sure too, where they act with intent and they speak, within species and interspecially. And yet they don't have a nervous system. So there's some thought, though people are sort of reticent to say it, that their entire bodies are their brains, and that the sensitivity that they, that is their life, is how they draw their intelligence and express it. And I just wondered if you had anything to say about that.
I'm happy to jump in on this one. So yes, that is a large conversation in the field, and there was for a little while a Society of Plant Neurobiology, which was then very quickly the others in the scientific realm just wrote negatively about that, and so the term was changed. But I think it's important to be careful about terminology and what does the word actually mean. Which word are we using? Are we using consciousness or cognition or sentience? And extended cognition is one of the ways that some of the more recent scientists are thinking about the ways that plants may have a brain or intelligence, and without having neurons and kind of the hardware. Kind of makes me think of kind of going back all the way to Aristotle, where he said that plants can't have sense perception because they don't have a mean, they don't have an organ to have this. And it seems like this debate is in some ways continuing with the plant intelligence debate. And as you said, there are certain ways in which plants certainly exhibit intelligence. So I guess in my perspective, the way that that happens seems to be less important than what it means that plants do seem to have that capacity. And I prefer the term plant intelligence myself, thinking about the ways that plants interact with their environment and interact with other plants and other beings, and also our human relationships to plants. I think that terminology to me is the one that is the most descriptive of the way that it's, from what I've read in the literature and my experience with trees and plants directly, makes the most sense to use. But of course, we could have that conversation all night or all afternoon.
Yeah. Thank you.
But I'm curious what my colleagues in the volume think as well.
I would just add, maybe on a note about the title. The title could be read like two different ways, and I think we're aware of this, like that we humans need wisdom to get through this planetary crisis and climate emergency, loss of biodiversity and deforestation and so forth. And that spending time with trees can help us to reflect, to gain a deeper sense of time, etc., that we acquire the wisdom. But there's also a suggestion, or another way to read that, is that the trees may possibly embody a certain kind of wisdom themselves. And we don't necessarily claim that, but it's something to be open to, especially when whether we could talk about intelligence or agency or a series of concepts or ideas. But if you look at these things on a gradation in terms of distinctions and differences, that there's, just as we might speak sometimes more metaphorically, of the wisdom of the child, the wisdom of the body, the wisdom of places, right? There's that openness to the possibility that trees may be not just more than human, but uh, share certain capacities that we often elevate, and we don't know, and yet the science is still emerging, as well as the thinking about thinking. The same thing is going on with artificial intelligence, and especially when you get networks, um, the fungal networks and the in situ chemicals that are wafted to communicate. There's clearly communication going on. And so at what point does this arise to intelligence? I don't know that we need to decide that right now, but just be mindful and aware of the possibilities there, and that certainly minimally we can acquire a kind of wisdom that we need from the arboreal world.
Thank
I
you,
think that's maybe
Laura.
partly why, sorry, the blanking on the tree name now.
The angel oak.
No, I'll think of it. Sorry.
So, but thank you for that, David. I appreciate that comment actually, and also just your point that maybe we don't need to answer that question right now, but that we need to sit with the question for a little bit. And Don, if you have anything to add to what Laura and David have said, please do. But to sort of bring us to a close, I'd like to ask you to read something from the afterword. If you would like to, sort of in a way of summing up our conversation and our time together.
Well, I will just read why I chose the title. So those of you who had not read the book, I called it the Sequoia Archipelago. I was inspired to entitle this the archipelago, inspired by Alexander Solzhenitsyn's revolutionary book about the chain of Soviet prison camps that used to stretch out through Siberia to the far east where the sequoias live. That chain was populated with creative, courageous dissidents who, like the redwoods, carried forward in their silence the deeper human values that Stalin was intent on destroying. Many of whom survived to carry on their works as guides for how to stand firm in one's hopes and values in the presence of severe attempts to muffle their voices. But like those courageous survivors, an end to captivity leaves difficult challenges about how to and where to go now that some bonds of thinking about our existence on this planet have been broken. We are faced with the complexities of dealing with centuries of oppression, neglect, unchecked greed, and outright mistakes of otherwise well-intentioned judgments about how to live sustainably and justly in this amazing home in which we find ourselves, in reflecting on the lessons from the residues, period, and reflecting on the residues of the 2024 elections, it is clear that many of us who engaged in addressing the ecological emergencies have neglected to our peril the often desperate needs of salaried laborers and their families, such as those left behind in the decline of the lumber industry. This volume of intricate and thoughtful reflections on one small part of this monumental challenge is itself a step towards solutions to model how to work together more effectively, addressing the whole picture before us. Perhaps we will be helped in this task by learning from the trees themselves how to be more quiet with each other, swaying in the wind, letting our common roots join theirs in reaching down into the earth itself for strength and balance, reaching for the light.
Thank you so much, Don, for that. Appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, David, for putting this wonderful volume together for us. And thank you for everyone's presence. We really, truly appreciate your participation, and apologies if we didn't get to your comments or your questions. But we hope that you will engage with this rich volume, and that you will take this out into your world or sphere of influence and continue the conversation. So hope everyone has a wonderful night further.
It was fun to read through what people's favorite trees are.
Yes.
Strangler fig.
Yes. And David, I'll send you the recording once I put it up on YouTube. And Laura, yeah, I'll do the same for you. Hi, V. Violetta is our operations specialist for our department, so she was sending out the notices promoting the event to students.